Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Brookman, Associate Director of Knowledge Transfer and Exchange, and on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar. We're grateful to the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and of course to our presenters who provide their expertise. We ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar as a courtesy to the presenters and all participants. The format of today's webinar is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period with our presenter today. During the question and answer period, we ask that you type into the chat box. The chat box can be pulled up on your screen by selecting the chat icon in the control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to the presenter or a similar question should we have duplicate themes. However, should you have a pressing question or issue, such as a technology glitch, that cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this into the chat box and we will do our best to address it right away. This webinar will be recorded, with the recording being made available to you on our website, along with the presenter slides shortly after today's webinar. You will also be sent a link to an evaluation. Please fill out this evaluation as it will assist us in the future delivery of our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and remember to watch the CRE-MSD website and the MSD prevention site for new resources and events. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter, Dr. Peter Keir. Peter is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University. His research aims to determine the mechanisms of work-related musculoskeletal disorders of the upper extremity. These disorders include those pertaining to muscle tissue, connective tissue, such as tendinitis, and peripheral nerve, such as carpal tunnel syndrome. His research tools include imaging, ultrasound MRI, computer modeling, electromyography, EMG, and motion measurement. Thank you so much, Peter, for agreeing to present this morning. Now over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Great to be here today. Today we're going to talk about a seed grant that we had and what's come of it since regarding lifting heavy slabs and the issues associated with that and dropping potential drops in the masonry industry. So I'm trying to get myself set up here. Oh, that's not working. Oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my system set up here, and all of a sudden I'm not rolling forward anymore.
No worries, we see.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, great.
Okay. I've got many ways to do these things. So I wanted to highlight the people that were involved in this study, starting with, from the right side, actually, Colin McKinnon, who submitted the CRE-MSD seed grant for this, and Dan Mulla, who wrote it with him. And then the two people that actually did the work for it, Riley Craig and Andrew Wong, were both master's students with me. They started the first project I'll talk about was their independent study within the grad program, and they worked on that together, looking at different parts of it. And then Riley Craig chose, as part of the COVID spin that we had to do when we couldn't bring in more participants, he took another look at the data. So I'm going to talk about both of those today. Oops. So today what I want to look at, I'll introduce you with some of the issues that we have out there in the masonry trade. We'll discuss team lifting. As much as we all have lifted a couch with somebody else or moved furniture, there is very little information out there on team lifting. Especially what I'll talk about today is our four-person drop study. Along with team lifting calls goes something called joint action, which is people working together. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at our 4-person lift drop study, and then I'll talk about the secondary analysis of it, trying to get some information on joint action and how people work together. And then we'll look at potential solutions and the issues and a few take-home points, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion. So the problems. This must be 2.5 years ago now that I got a call from the Masonry and Allied Trade Labor Management Committee saying they have big concerns about their lifting heavy slabs, people dropping it, new people coming on and maybe being an issue, that sort of thing. And then the bigger point too is lifting very heavy slabs, some of them over 200 kilograms, but awkward postures, getting them in the right place, an environment you see in the picture here that might be a little slippery or uneven. And then what materials they're lifting as well. Some are easier, some are really oddly shaped things, sometimes at the whim of the architects. But and then there's the multi-person lifts and how people work together on that. So we know lifts are awkward and heavy in the masonry industry. We can't always break down loads or change them like we can in other parts of ergonomics. And one of the big points is these lifts are often well beyond the single person lifts, even when we divide up the weight between people. So we need teams of 2 or more, and that happens a lot in the industry. So we know masons are at risk for developing MSDs. Obviously, they're using heavy construction materials in a variety of weather conditions as well. There's a weight issues, frequency issues, and sometimes it comes in bursts, spurts and bursts. So sometimes it's really heavy and sometimes it's not. But there are postural challenges. And if you've ever done any, even any tile work or anything in your house, you know that your back is going to get stiff and sore because of the posture. And there are a significant number of claims, lost time claims in Ontario. So switching a little bit to team lifting. There is a lot of team lifting that happens in the world, and you can think of it in your everyday life. But there aren't very well-established guidelines. And we can go through a few studies here. At the top, there's a couple. Bill Maris down at Ohio State, who's known for doing great spine research over decades, suggested over 20 years ago now that 25 kilograms per lifter times how many lifters you have would be a good level. Now, if you're familiar with it, you know that that's already exceeding a perfect scenario lift of 23 kilograms in the NIOSH equation. Other people, Barrett and Dennis, have looked at some other ideas. It should be 50 to 80% of the sum strength of the team, or 1.75 times each individual, or one individual in the team, for how heavy it should be for a team of 4 anyway. So that's less than half the total weight. In terms of biomechanical findings, there's not a lot out there. Some groups find that people can do more in a group scenario than individually. A higher max voluntary contraction or a group lift is greater than the sum of the parts. And the groups I've mentioned above there, Barrett and Dennis and Visser from overseas, indicates what we would all think. If we have more lifters, we can have decreased lumbar spine torque and compression forces in the spine. Now that makes a lot of sense if things are divided out equally, but often, and one of the scenarios that was discussed when we first took this on was what happens with 3 people if you have a long object that has to be lifted. The person in the middle often doesn't do much of the work, and the workers know that. The idea of joint action is done by the people in motor control for the most part, and it hasn't really been looked at from our point of view with biomechanics and some of the measurements we can take, like muscle activity and things like that. So joint action in and of itself is the coordination of more than one person acting to accomplish a task. So most of us have done the job on the left, moving a couch at some point. And we all have our scenarios about somebody's going to drop it or whatever else. The middle one is just people talking or rock, paper, scissors, getting that done. And dancing is a good example as well. So people coordinating to get a task together. In terms of the coordination in joint action, so we have two or more people. One of the strategies that people use is to intentionally decrease the variability of their actions. Make yourself more known on what you're going to do. Increase predictability of the coordination to help with coordination. Some of these outcomes, decreasing the variability, may actually lead to certain issues and overuse of some tissues in terms of musculoskeletal disorders. Oops. There we go. The other component in this talk, in this area, is sudden loading or sudden unloading. If the person drops, that's a sudden unload. If the other people carrying an object would be a sudden load. So there have been a number of studies looking at different sudden loads, and I can think of some more that aren't listed here that are supposed to simulate impacts in hockey and things like that as well. So there's some work out there. But if we look at all these things, sudden horizontal force to cause trunk flexion, sudden loading of a box held in the hand, so basically dropping a weight into a box that somebody's holding, pulling a loaded box, or a sudden release load. If you're like me and have had this, if you've ever worked out on one of those machines that has a pin to select the weights and the pin falls out, that's a sudden load release. And it can be quite traumatizing at the moment. So these are mainly, as you see in the image here of one of the setups, they're single lifters. What happens when we have multiple lifters? How does the action of one person affect the other workers or the other lifters? So somebody dropping it, that's probably good for them because they're not holding the load. But what happens to other people? If you're lifting a couch, that end falls. The other person may be on the stairs, as often happens in our household. And there may be a negative consequence. So our objective was to look at changes in external forces, so forces acting on the hand, and muscle activity with people holding a load and an unanticipated drop. So we mentioned masonry and allied trades having concerns about lifting awkward loads and worried about what happens with drops. And as you'll find out, we used a light load of about 60 kilograms between 4 people, but stone slabs may be well over 200 kilograms. It depends on the thickness, the shape, all kinds of things. So we decided to look at the distribution of hand and muscle loads with 4-member slab. We called it a slab because that's what the masonry industry calls the big piece of rock. And see how they change with a single team member. So we end up with, it was a pilot study really. So we had 24 participants, all males, broke them up into six groups of 4, and we made sure that they had no prior injuries. And they were all from the university community. So they're kind of top-ended around just over 30 years of age. And as it worked out, the groups were all similar in height and weight as a group and age. So what we actually did was we had a 60 kilogram slab, and I'll show you that in a minute. We had a square version and a rectangular version. So 2 feet by 2 feet and 2 feet by 4 feet. And then we had them do a number of lifts. We chose a 60 kilogram slab because we had to do it ethically, and we didn't know what the loads would be on the people catching the load, the remaining people after somebody dropped the load. And our ethics tends to be a little conservative. So we wanted to go light. And hopefully when we find something out from this study, we can gain it up to a heavier load, and we can test that later as well. And what we did was, there's 4 people, so we had 4 releases. Each person dropped the load at some point. But we had 11 normal, so we had 15 lifts per slab, and we had 4 drops and 11 normal. The idea being that you want to have enough simple lifts without a drop that they're not expecting the drop, and it's still unique to them. And the way we actually did the drop, or told the person that was going to do the release, is old school, a little piece of paper. One of the researchers walked around everybody in the group and showed them a piece of paper, and it said drop or not drop on it. So this is our slab. It turned out to be a woodworking experience. Colin McKinnon did a great job doing this. This is in the expanded version, and I'll just point out some things. You'll see some other views of this as well. But we had a weight on top, and that we could change it. We set it up so we could actually change that. A little shelf to hold it. And then we had these arms here that can actually move in here, and you'll see that in a second, to create the 2x2 and extend out on basically on very sturdy runners for drawers. On each end of these, we had a force cube down here and a metal plate that the force cube was actually attached to. And the force cube is a three-dimensional, measures forces and torques in 3 dimensions. So each person would have one hand on the end and one hand on the side for a typical corner lift. So the 2 configurations looked something like this, where we had the 2x2, everything's tucked in nicely. And again, just 15 trials total. And then we had pulled them out, and we had a 2x4 foot rectangle. We used nice, sturdy drawer runners, but found out one thing about torques on one of our first trials, where it actually, everything rotated and spun off, and we actually had a drop that was totally unexpected by everybody, including the crew. This is a photo of our setup, and we put several safety checks involved. We had a weight in the middle of the shelf here with a foam container, so to speak, to hold the plate in place. We had a number of markers on there. I'll take those off for a sec. These are all markers, so our our motion capture system could actually look at those. We had a cable so that if they dropped it, nobody would get hurt. The load would be suspended. And those are our force cubes in there. And down at the bottom, sorry, we made sure that they weren't lifting with a flex spine, so they lifted from knee level to hip level, basically. So the protocol started out, and this is just an example here. One trial, 15 lifts, and the maroon ones are the actual drops in there. So they were randomized throughout those between the 4 corners. And once again, what they actually did, lift from knee to knuckle height, but the 4 people lifted it up for 3 seconds, became a steady state. And then there was up to 5 seconds before a drop and recovery. So one person in this point would drop it, and then the 3 people would again maintain a steady state after that. So we were looking at all aspects of that, or trying to. And I have a little video here. Hopefully it's going to run. Oops. Not sure what I'm doing here. Oh, sorry. So you can actually see the lifters doing this, and hopefully this keeps running as we do this. Hopefully it runs again, so I can tell you a little bit. We had the forces at each corner. We had EMG. We have a 16-channel wireless system. So what we actually did was split them up between all the people. We chose to do the right side only, just to see what would happen. So the anterior deltoid, the biceps, upper trapezius, and the lumbar erector spinae. And we've talked about everything else on here. So this slide is similar to the other one, except I'm describing now what we had here. So on one corner, and this would change throughout each of the trials, we had the dropper. On the square one, we'd call it left and right sides, and then we had opposite. We changed our language a little bit on the rectangle because as the dropper moved around, these long adjacent and short adjacent sides changed as we went. So we still have dropper and opposite. This is the long adjacent side and the short adjacent side. So if the dropper moved down to this part down here, this would be the short adjacent and this would be the long adjacent. And I'm going to use these before Andrew made up those really cool three-dimensional drawings. We had this. So this is the little icon I'll use as we move along here. So dropper, left, right, opposite, dropper, short adjacent, opposite, long adjacent. So what do we find out? First off, what did the data look like for one thing? So we have all these phases up here. I'm going to click through here. So this is the part we looked at in here. This part, and this part. So we have pre-drop, just before somebody's going to drop, the catch phase, and then three lifter steady state. So if you actually look at the graph here, we can actually see all the lifters started up with a load, then they're holding it, trying to go for steady state. We can actually see in this one that the short adjacent and long adjacent sides actually bore more of the load anyway. Sorry, the short adjacent, the blue is opposite, and the red is dropper, and the black is the long adjacent side. So you can actually see how they go up. They're not evenly distributed. That was one of the funny things we found. And we found it wasn't due to height or weight. We couldn't figure out that. You can see the peaks in the catch zone here. We can see that the dropper drops off entirely, which is a good thing because they let go. The opposite side gets a great benefit. They're not lifting very much. And the short adjacent and long adjacent sides bear the brunt of the load during the three lifter portion. So what do we find out? Well, first off, we found this is the square load, so I've got the little icon down here, fairly evenly distributed. Some corners have more variability than others, but after the drop,
Peter, you're on mute.
heard a boop. There we go. I didn't know how to get it back on WebEx. Okay, I'm back now.
You're back. Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
So on the square load, what we found were the two adjacent sides, so left and right side. So what we have here, sorry, I didn't explain that, is force, the dropper over here. So the dropper, after they've let go, their force goes to zero. The left side, the opposite, and the right side. And we find the left and the right go up considerably. Oh. And the post drop, the opposite side is much lower. On the rectangular load, it's even a more heightened effect than that. So I've got a question mark here. Is this evenly balanced? We can see the dropper and the opposite are actually seem to be lower than the long adjacent and short adjacent. So not equal balancing. Our first assumption is always, oh, it would be equal balance, but it doesn't seem to be. The short adjacent side on the three after the drop is much higher than the other ones. So we have long adjacent, we also have a higher one, and the post drop, the opposite is much lower. Now, the interesting thing here is this one is about at 150 newtons, which is what we would expect, about 15 kilograms per person. If I didn't point it out on the last slide, but it was a little bit lower than that. So we have some questions about that. We check things and we can't find an explanation. The muscle activity turns out is much higher So we have, sorry, on this one we have the mean EMG during the steady state 4-person in pink, and in turquoise we have the 3-person steady state. So EMG basically goes down to near zero for the dropper. This is biceps brachii, anterior deltoid or shoulder, and the upper trapezius on the back of the neck. And we can see that the person left of the dropper has a great increase on their EMG. The left deltoid goes up. The left upper trap goes up. Now, part of the explanation for this is we only did the right side, so the right arm on the left, if the person to the left would have their right arm, or the one that's we have the EMG on, right beside them. So that's the closest arm, so we'd expect a bigger effect there. So what we found was the shape of the load affects the load distribution between the individuals, both before and after the drop. And following the release, the lifters on either side of the dropper had increased loading, and the opposite loader actually got decreased loading. So the response was also heightened for the short adjacent lifter on the 2x4 scenario. So that's a greater risk of injury for that individual. So just to summarize and do some bullet points, load and shape alter force production or force contribution during the sudden release. I didn't say this before, but that short adjacent lifter on the 2x4 setting sometimes took up to 43% of the total team load. So all of a sudden, what seemed like 60 kilograms split 4 ways seemed to be reasonable, all of a sudden became very high for that individual. And that's not the peak load during the actual catch phase, because we had trouble actually getting that data. And the lifter closest to the dropper has greater muscle activity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the talk. So all of this together says the sudden load release is definitely a possibility for injury mechanism. We do have some issues, some limitations. We did not match anybody for height, strength, weight, or strength. The slab weight was very conservative, but we actually saw some pretty high loads in individuals. So I'd be scared to take it up much higher than that, but obviously we would have to if we had some rehearsed, practiced workers doing it. We only had one side of muscle activity. Our protocol itself is not realistic for the real world. The lift, hold, and lower protocol, and we were called out on that right off the bat, but we had to start somewhere. What the masonry industry were concerned about is lift and carry and higher lifts than that, and more awkward lifts as well. So the big take-home point from that is the lifter closest to the dropper experiences the greatest loads. Now, I want to run through this, and I'll go through it fairly quickly because it's a lot of this COVID-19 spin thesis pivot by Riley Craig was looking at the data from the point of view of can we see in the data that the dropper is giving away that they're going to drop, or can we see any indications that people are communicating non-verbally, because they weren't talking during this. Not like when you're lifting the couch or moving the furniture and going, I'm going to drop it, I'm going to drop it. That we weren't allowing that in the study. So this is Riley Craig's thesis. I guess he's getting close to a year ago defending, so that's good. So the aim of his thesis was to look at how individuals work together in the task. And do a lifter's biomechanical signals alert other lifters of a release or drop in the task? The big questions were, is there a connection between first the dropper and the lifter opposite them, because they would obviously have the best eye contact, and was there any sequential operation between the other lifters? He had a number of hypotheses. we thought that perhaps the lifter who's the dropper will alert people by having a little change in their vertical force or a change in their muscle activity that might be seen, that might be felt by the other ones, or even a tightening of the force or being more still. And is this response seen in others as well? Um, the first, from knowing what we knew already, he thought the individual lifter response would be first seen in the droppers or the lifters adjacent to the dropper, then the one farther away. And he wanted to see if people were using anticipatory muscle activity. Did other lifters' muscle activity change before the um, the drop actually happened? So we have another video of, and this one is not a drop trial, I don't think. Let me get up here and see if I can do this again. I don't know if you can hear the video or not on this. This is Andrew Wong on the side here. The far person actually dropped it this time. And he goes in to check to see if everything's there. So everything else is the same. I just wanted to bring these images back up just in case you didn't catch them the first time. So again, we had the 4-person steady drop. This is the same data exactly. Same drop zone and a 3-person steady lift afterwards. Same data as well. This is Riley's slide. This is exactly the same slide as I showed you before. So we're actually looking at what's going on in this pre-drop phase here. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Once again, the dropper, left, right, opposite, dropper, short adjacent, long adjacent, opposite. The one thing that we did in Riley's study was, let's take a look at what's the variability in a normal lift from just lifting up to this position and holding. What are we expecting in terms of the baseline in forces and EMGs in individuals? And what is the normal fluctuation or variance of the data in terms of the vertical force, resultant force, and the EMGs themselves? So just to give you an idea, I'm going to show a slide that's a little different than this in a second. This is the same slide, basically the same slide as I showed you before, with our force, dropper, the left position, opposite position, or right position, with all the same data. And this time I will point out that rather than being at approximately 150 newtons that we would expect, if we draw a line across here, and this is not a statistical line, it's an eyeball line, we see that's actually below 150 newtons per person. So there are things going on, and we'll get to that in a little bit here. So we can see that the left and right, the adjacent lifters, have higher forces after the drop, and when it's a 3-person lift. And the person, obviously, that's on the side doesn't lift as much. And we can look at the same data again for the rectangular version. So the drop of the long adjacent, short adjacent is the highest force, and the opposite is the lowest. But having seen that and knowing that these values were not perfect, the pre-drop is in the evenly balanced, it doesn't quite look that way. We thought, oh, is the dropper doing something here? Because they're actually a lower value to start off with. So is something going on with that? So we actually took a look at the data during the steady state 4-person lift in terms of the position rather than dropper, which changed. The dropper moved around as each person did it. The position 1, position 2, position 3, and position 4. And just as an idea, the position 1, I believe, was the closest to the camera in the videos I showed you. And we can see that there is a big variability depending on the position they were at. And this didn't change. This is, we have 6 participants in each of these categories, P1, P2, P3, P4, 6 groups, so 6 people at each station. And this is 22 data points times 6 people. So there's a lot of data points in there. And we can see that for whatever reason, it looks like, now these aren't significantly different, but the P1 position was actually higher than the other positions. And that's for the square. We can see it comes in at about 150 newtons there. And then for the rectangle, we can see they line up a little bit better, which is strange because on the other slide I showed you, it didn't look like they did line up so well. So we're not sure what's going on. We checked all the devices and everything else because that was a concern. And so what it means is there's variability in how people lift. So what Riley wanted to get into too was looking at, do we have an anticipatory movement, which would happen before this spike here represents where the lift occurs? Do we have a short latency response, so a reflex response? And we've taken some liberties with the reflexive action here and had it go up to 100 long latency reflex, up to 150 milliseconds. And what he's got labeled here is long latency. So is it beyond the time of a reaction or a reflex? So a few data points here. We have the time to peak force in seconds from when they initiated the drop. So we can actually see, look down here, from 0 seconds, we have 2 people that showed up before 150 milliseconds, and the vast majority, all the other ones, happened after that. So it's not a reflex from the drop. The time to meet peak muscle activity, what we found was this is the bicep on the left and the lower erector spinae on the right, and we can actually see that this red line here is at 0 or 25 milliseconds, and the next red line is at 150 milliseconds, and we can see 1 in each case that made it into that reflex category, but everything else is longer latency. And if we actually take a closer look, we'll see that the bicep being closer to the load itself actually had a quicker response than the lower erector spinae did. And then that's shown up a little bit better here too. Time to peak force versus time to peak muscle activity on the adjacent lifters. So what he found was, if we look here, we have, these are the same as before, a count here, time across the bottom, and we can see the time to peak force, which he did have some trouble actually capturing. Time to peak force to the bicep force, or bicep max back activity, was below half a second for sure, peak here for most of them, but we can actually see a little bit longer delay over to where it was for the lower erector spinae. So that makes total sense to us that the biceps would have a quicker response than the lower erector spinae because the force has to go through the system on that. So what do we find out from this idea of joint action? And I don't know if I said it before, but the idea of joint action has never really been addressed in terms of these biomechanical variables before. So Riley took a big step out on this and found the top thing there that says the data didn't show that droppers' force and muscle activity differed between the drop and the non-drop trials. And there were very few anticipatory muscle activity outcomes, so people weren't thinking ahead or anticipating what people were doing, which basically got us to the comment that our original study was good. We did a good job having people have an unexpected drop. So, and by that we mean there were no tells. The lifters and droppers did not give away that they were going to drop it. So they all did their job well. In terms of limitations, obviously this was not the original intention. We would have done the study differently if that was the case. And done some other really interesting things, which he actually did a proposal for, but didn't get to do. Obviously, we're not very representative of the loads and the weights, and the way people drop the load is not the way it would happen in the field. You would have some tells, you would have some slippage and that sort of things. And again, we have the other issues that we had before. So what do we want to do in the future? What do we think should be done? And what have we been told would be a good idea um, in some of our masonry meetings? The whole idea about comparing matched and mismatched individuals, it tells you maybe how in the field you would line up or put people around a lift to do it. Do you have strong people opposite weaker people, or how do we do that? Or do we match them by strength? And that's been done a little bit in the literature, but not that much. And they do a lot of two-person lifts and a lot of two-person awkward lifts. So that was the idea that Riley wanted to do for his thesis, to look at more detail of those, have one person getting the loads under each hand. Different lift and carries, knee to shoulder transfer lifts, elevation and angle changes and things like that, and as well as some even more specific industry specific lifts. In terms of joint action in the biomechanics we could do with it, more EMG, do eye tracking to see what people are looking at. Are you looking at somebody's hands to see if they're slipping or not? And the big thing in all of this is training. We know even on their computer studies where they try to do joint action, training is a big thing. So that may be a big part of what needs to happen in the industry. Do we have solutions? There's lots of solutions out there. The only problem with them is there's no universal solution. A lot of them, and I'll show it by example, these two individuals lifting a concrete slab that's very form fitted. They can use this sort of device here that's got a vacuum on it and that sort of thing because it can create a seal. Other interesting devices like this lifter over here would be good for a two-person lift under certain circumstances. Um, that kind of goes, the suction cup kind of thing goes with this one up at the top corner here as well. And this is just taken from a site with somebody who thought they had a lot of solutions for things. And yes, we can roll slabs across that or use a dolly or hand cart for those things. They don't work in all situations. And a lot of times solutions need to be made in the moment. Or on the other hand, maybe they should be thought of beforehand so we can actually put some of these into being. Some other ideas out here, specialized tools, or this little simple paver lifter down here, great idea. These individuals don't look like they're working too hard lifting that. I like this picture in here in the middle at the bottom because it looks like ancient Egypt or something like that, but showing you that yokes and old fashioned things still work. Followed up by the newfangled thing. We just had a washing machine delivered and they used exactly this setup to do it. They weren't smiling as much, but that may have nothing to do with the straps. And finally, we can always think of this as, I had the pleasure of carrying by hand way back when, before I went back to grad school, big slabs like this one. Four of us got involved and it was very awkward, and there's a big concern on that. This requires a hoist. A hoist can't be used in all places, so people end up lifting devices like, or slabs like this. And the big solution may be hiring strategy. If we could get all masons to do these Atlas stones and be super strong, maybe we wouldn't need all these other things. But that's a totally different scenario, and I say that facetiously. So our take-home points overall: four-person lift. The lifter closest to the dropper bears the heaviest burden, and the opposite lifter is unloaded, so to speak. Load and shape and the position of the individual alter force contribution during the sudden relief. With rectangular loads, the short adjacent lifter has huge peak forces, even approaching 40 to 50% of the total team load. Obviously, that's beyond recommendations, even with our light load. And and most people would agree that the sudden load release in team lifting is a possible mechanism for industry, masonry workers for injury. I'd like to thank the people in my lab, the McMaster Occupational Biomechanics Lab, CRE-MSD for the funding. Um, Colin McKinnon was the PI on this seed grant. Dan Mulla was a co-investigator with me on it. And the input from the Masonry and Allied Trades Labor Management Committee has been really good, even though we've had our delays on setting things up. And I'll just leave this slide up if anybody wants to contact me or is interested in my information, and we'll open it up to questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Peter. This was really informal and informative. Informal in the way that the way you presented it, I think we could all relate to it. And I'm sure some of us have had experience with being the dropper and not trying to drop. Given that none of us know who the dropper is going to be, do you have any recommendations for fitness training? You talked about training, but do you have any recommendations for fitness related to exercise for either our biceps or our upper back when we are going to be lifting or in the industry of lifting?
Yeah, well, that's a I've always worried about this, and maybe somebody else will have a comment about this. Um, there are days, especially when they're doing this, and I have done the grunt work, so I know that some days are harder than others. Um, but trying to get people to do strength training after a tiring day in the field is very difficult. So I think a certain level, always a certain level, everything we've seen is a certain level of fitness and strength is better. You're less likely to be injured if you're stronger. But the big thing in training is proper training and proper posture and knowing when it's going to be overloaded. We had a little conversation earlier, Catherine, that um, about stronger individuals and how sometimes they're called in to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And my comment at the time was um, in the field, I think people are worried about who's going to do the dropping, and there's a great psychological issue on that as well, on who might be. And it, generally, it might be the new person who's not used to lifting with these individuals. So training the individuals to work together is very important.
Right. And how to lift. So if doesn't matter how
Right.
strong you are, if you don't know how to lift properly, you're not going to help the team. So thank you for making that point. Was there a correlation studied on trained versus untrained lifters? The more coordinated they became in adapting to the drop condition, for instance.
So there isn't in this four-person scenario, there's nothing like that. But we do know from the joint action research that as people work together, they become more coordinated. So starting cold, um, two people that don't know each other, never seen each other, um, um, would benefit by working together to figure out how to do it. So training of all individuals on a little bit of this, and I'm no expert on that at this point. We're just branching out into this idea of joint action, and there is so much to do in that field. It turns out a lot of these joint action studies, if they say they do lifting, it's on a computer screen trying to match what the other person is doing. So it's very different than real world scenario.
Thanks, Peter. And as we anticipated, another good question is related to gender. Do you think an all female or mixed gender team may respond differently, or have you seen any data related to gender impact?
I see Karen asked that. Hey, Karen. Um, Yeah, there's probably more so on the mismatch of height, weight, strength rather than male female per se, but I'm not sure. The studies that have been done um, in team lifting have done weird scenarios where they created some barbell that four people lift. So everybody was in a line. So I don't think that is, there are specific studies done in mixed gender. Um, and they have to limit to the total, and but they're looking at total strength, um, as opposed to how do people lift this heavy load. Um, so yes, I do believe there would be very different results. We tried to make sure everybody, and that was one of the reasons why we used men only, to try to not be set up these scenarios where the tall person was opposite the short person and that thing. I think that's a big thing, and I also think that in the industry there's probably some biases out there as well on the lifting aspect of it. And I think there's a huge area of the psychology of this as well.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Was the lower erector spine muscle activation measured on the same side, opposite or both sides to the dropper position? And would you expect a higher activation of the LES on the side, further from the dropper?
So I'm reading the question again there. So the I actually don't know what to think on that one. So the bicep was very obvious that we had higher levels in the arm that was closest to the dropper, which makes total sense. The erector spinae, I can see the thought about we only had the one side. We only did right side for all muscles. So I don't actually know. I could see it creating a torque and creating a bigger activation there, but I couldn't answer that one
Okay.
specifically.
No
Yeah.
problem. Can't answer everything. That's why
So
we have research, right?
a lot of these things are what we were trying to do, and then COVID hit. So we had great follow-up stuff.
Do you think that adjusting the setup for the knuckle height for all the participants would have changed the EMG results as well as the latency responses?
I don't think so, mainly because the most of those measures I showed were from the steady state, so they're already lifted up to waist height, or I guess they're up to knuckle height. But um, we didn't actually end up analyzing the position of the slab. We there was enough information in here. We thought that we didn't actually go through the pain of doing all the digitizing for it. We had some issues at the time that we didn't do that. But that would be a great thing to see what the slope is of that and actually get some insight on um, the angles created in 3 dimensions by shorter lifters, taller lifters,
Mhm.
different strategies.
Okay, an interesting question here around variation in the time of day. Was there any variation in the time of day in the studies? And would higher muscle activation be expected later in the day due to fatigue than in the morning or midday?
I don't have an answer for that one. There may be, there was enough, I would say in this pilot study we did, there's enough variability that it would have got washed out, I'm pretty sure anyway.
Mm-hmm. It also reminds me of our green energy webinar series where we looked at the impact of heat on performance. So weather could also have an impact um, as well.
This was done in the summer, so I'm pretty sure people would have found our lab. I think it was the summer that our lab was actually air conditioned and not the time that was over 30 degrees. But um, so it would have been, people would have been fairly content in the cool room.
Interesting.
I will say that we one of the things that's turns out to be very important because we've done a number of fatigue studies in the arm and shoulder is trying to explain the data for how long somebody can keep going, it turns out there's the person's mindset and their they call it mental depletion is important as well. We had somebody come into the lab and where people doing upper extremity work, as long as they could go. We had one person who did everything identical in every trial. They lasted 1 hour. And then we had another individual at 4 hours say, do I have to keep going? Um,
Wow.
and then there was another individual that came into the lab and was done in 10 minutes. So at that point, we started trying to look at some of the mental depletion. I have a colleague who does that kind of research, and it's fascinating. We haven't gotten very far with it, but the state of the mind and how how spent somebody is, if you will, in terms of mental fatigue is very important in this. And this would be something in a real world scenario that probably plays a big role.
The whole work-life balance issue, and the impact that all of this has on employers should we ever have the day where we actually have a choice related to workers when we don't have such HR issues. The last question of the day, Peter, is from Lisa B. Tolley at Ontario Power Generation. Are you aware of similar studies of team pushing or pulling of heavy loads?
Hi, Lisa. Congratulations, by the way. Have not seen anything like that. We weren't specifically looking for it, but it hasn't come up in what we know and what we've seen. It's
Well,
it's actually amazing when you start getting into this idea of team lifting and pushing and pulling and that there is a dearth of information out there. So a lot of this has been going on. Looking at some of the study, yes, you can be very critical of what we did. What we're looking at, we had to start somewhere because there's nothing out there really to speak of that's actually anywhere near functional. So there's so much work to be done in this area, and it's a fascinating area. The only problem is that to do a study, everything's that they do in the workplaces is almost a one-off. So trying to come up with unique situations all the time, it's kind of the scenario where you want to have people come in and do as much work as you can in all these different scenarios. Ethics would never pass it. So, but uh, um, but there's so much information to gather out there.
thanks so much, Peter. We have a meeting this afternoon with the Community of Practice for Client Patient Handling to look at alternatives for two-person lifts. And, the transferable knowledge here that we're all looking for is, what can we do to make it more efficient within ourselves? So definitely looking at those resources from the MSD prevention guideline on how to lift properly, and also looking, as you say, on the what resources are out there related to the whole aspect of team lifting and what we can do to ready a team to lift as a team. I want to thank Peter and all of you for your excellent questions today and encourage you to join us on August 9th for our next webinar exploring the efficacy of portable lift assist devices relative to large mechanical lifts to lift fallen residents. So we hope to see you then and hope everyone has a great summer. And thanks again for joining us today at CRE-MSD. And thank you again, Peter, for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, everybody.